10:45 a.m. on the 28th of June 1914, Apulki, Sarajevo, administrative capital of the Condominium of Bosnia and Herzegovina, then a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This would be the date and location where one of the most infamous assassinations in history took place. You probably know which one, of course. Traveling down from Apulki at that time was a motorcade carrying Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the presumptive heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie. But lurking on the corner was Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb about 1 month shy of his 20th birthday. In Princip's hand was an FN model pistol, and in his mind was malevolent intent. What happened next were 2 gunshots, and European history changed forever, and a political assassination, one of the most significant of all time, alongside those of Mahatma Gandhi, Julius Caesar, and Abraham Lincoln. The assassination led to the start of World War I, at the time the most destructive war in human history and the cause of millions of deaths in just a handful of years. But you already know all this, don't you? You know about the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. You also probably knew about Caesar's demise in the Roman Senate, Gandhi's murder by a Hindu nationalist, and the shooting of Abe Lincoln at Ford's Theatre in Washington. What you might not know about is the entries in today's video. So let's have a look at them, shall we? The assassination of Juan Prim, Spain, 1870. Let's start off in Spain, and an event long consumed by the passage of time, but one which bore ramifications that remained an issue even when the act itself was perhaps starting to be somewhat forgotten. Juan Prim y Prats was a Spanish general and statesman who, at the time of his death in 1870, occupied the office of Prime Minister of Spain. Born in Reus, Catalonia in 1814, he cut his teeth in the military during the turbulent era of Spain's Carlist Wars. You see, at the time, Spain was riven by succession disputes after King Ferdinand VII's death, with the so-called Carlists rallying behind his brother Don Carlos against supporters of the young Queen Isabella II. Luckily, Isabella could count on the support of Prim, who distinguished himself as an effective commander and helped see an end to the war for the Queen. During the Second Carlist War, he helped suppress uprisings in Catalonia, where support for the Carlist cause was strong. For this, he earned himself fame, promotion, and political influence. By the mid-19th century, Prim was more than a soldier. He was a statesman with a reputation for reformist ideas and fierce nationalism at a time when Spain was struggling to modernize its institutions while maintaining stability in a continent shaken by revolutions. But by 1868, Spain was in deep crisis. Queen Isabella II had never really proved all that popular, and so Prim turned out to be not all that loyal. He led a coalition of military generals in the so-called Glorious Revolution, which forced Isabella into exile and launched himself into the prime ministership. Spain now faced a daunting question: who would rule the ailing monarchy next? As the newly appointed prime minister, well, Prim was now kingmaker. He settled on Amadeo of Savoy, son of Italy's king Victor Emmanuel II, as Spain's next monarch. But this didn't make everyone very happy. Amadeo was foreign, had few ties to Spanish traditions, and at the time of his coronation was only 25 years old. Prim had chosen Amadeo due to like-minded political leanings, and also due to his conviction that only an outsider could avoid becoming lost to Spain's factional politics. And this sort of made sense, but to many, it made no sense, and Prim's enemies were multiplying very quickly. What remained of the Carlists saw him as a betrayer of Spain's dynastic traditions, and Spain's Republicans had wanted to simply do away with monarchy entirely, let alone import a foreign king to rule over them. On December 27, 1870, Prim was leaving the Spanish Parliament buildings in Madrid when assassins armed with revolvers and shotguns arrived on the scene. A burst of fire riddled his vehicle, and the Prime Minister was left severely wounded. He lived on for 2 days before dying on December 30th. Prim's death shocked Spain, not only because of his prominence, but also because it struck at the heart of the fragile political transition he had been engineering. 1 day later, on the 31st of December, Amadeo arrived in Spain to take over the throne. But without Prim, Amadeo had no support base and no way of holding together the fragile coalition of political factions who'd grudgingly agreed to his investiture together. His reign lasted a little over 2 years before collapsing into political chaos. Amadeo abdicated and returned to Italy. But the consequences of Prim's assassination did not stop there. With Amadeo now gone, the First Spanish Republic was proclaimed in 1873. This lasted all of a year before itself collapsing and being replaced by the Bourbon monarchy in 1874. The cycle continued as the Bourbon monarchy lasted until 1931, when the monarchy as a whole was swallowed up by the Spanish Second Republic, followed by civil war and descent into chaos. Many argue that without Prim's assassination, Spain's transition to a constitutional monarchy might have been steadier, sparing the country the following following decades of instability. Instead, his murder kicked off the cycle of coups, uprisings, and authoritarian reactions that defined Spain's modern history. Nobody was ever caught or convicted for the assassination. The assassination of Sadi Carnot in France in 1894. So, moving north to France about a quarter century later, it was now 100 years since the French Revolution, and the French Republic was young, fragile, and violently contested. In fact, it had already failed, since France was by now on its third republic in the space of a single century. It seemed this time they were determined to get it right, though, as the third republic was now in its 24th year of existence. But then its president was murdered. Marie-François Sadi Carnot was born into a family steeped in French political life. His grandfather, Lazare, had been a key figure during the French Revolution, remembered as the organizer of victory amid the turbulence of the 1790s. His father had also held political office, and Carnot seemed destined for the same. After training to be an engineer, he entered politics, gaining a reputation as a diligent and moderate Republican. It was largely for this reason that Carnot became president of France in 1887. The Third Republic was flailing, beset by monarchists and Bonapartists loyal to the old order. Not only that, but a new beast was beginning to emerge. Marxist socialist ideals had now gained traction, and the state was coming under pressure from socialists and anarchists to introduce change. The latter was not exactly Carnot's forte. He was a cautious leader, preferring stability to bold reforms. The radicals kind of hated this, and by the early 1890s, France was gripped by waves of anarchist violence, bombings, shootings, and assassinations. The government's response was swift and harsh, introducing the so-called villainous laws, which cracked down on anarchist groups, censored their publications, and jailed suspected sympathizers. And so the anarchists cracked down on Carnot. On June the 24th, 1894, he traveled to Lyon to attend a public banquet. As he rode through in an open carriage through the city streets, he was approached by an Italian anarchist named Sante Geronimo Caserio. Armed with a dagger, Caserio lunged at the president and stabbed him in the abdomen. Carnot collapsed and was rushed to a nearby hospital, but the wound proved fatal. He died that very night. The murder of a head of state in broad daylight seemed to confirm the worst fears of conservatives, that anarchism was not just a fringe nuisance, but a direct threat to civilization. Caserio was quickly tried and executed, showing no remorse. He claimed that Carnot's role in repressing anarchists justified the attack, and that the president had become the face of a system that crushed liberty in the name of order. But the killing also had other repercussions. It intensified France's crackdown on anarchists, reinforcing the state's repressive laws and fueling paranoia about radical movements across Europe. It deepened the sense of instability in the Third Republic, which was already heading toward the great political and social crisis of the Dreyfus Affair in the years to come. Internationally, Carnot's assassination fed into a wave of anarchist violence that claimed leaders across Europe and the Americas, from Italian kings to American presidents, and more on that in a bit. Carnot himself was mourned as a martyr for the Republic. His funeral drew massive crowds, and he was remembered as a man of probity who had guided France through troubled waters. Yet in death, he became more significant than it had ever been in life, his assassination symbolizing both the vulnerability of democratic institutions and the ferocity of the ideological battles raging in the late 19th century in Europe. The assassination of William McKinley in the United States in 1901. Okay, now let's journey over to Buffalo, New York, an event which shocked turn-of-the-century United States America and helped flip American politics right on its head. Once again, it was a self-identified anarchist who was behind this one. Bloody anarchists. Now, a quick pause. I know what some of you are say, what's this, Simon? I know all about the assassination of William McKinley. We learned about it in school. Well, maybe you did in American school, but I can tell you I learned nothing about it in England, and maybe the rest of our audience didn't either, so shout out to them. Honestly, I wasn't even sure. I didn't even know William McKinley was assassinated. I've probably made a video on it. William McKinley was born in Ohio and became the 25th president of the United States in 1897. Before that, in what will become the kind of theme in this list, he earned distinction as a military man, coming of age during the American Civil War, where he earned a reputation for steady leadership and bravery as part of the Union Army. After the war was when he entered politics, becoming a Republican governor of his home state, Ohio, in 1892. He quickly became a nationally renowned figure for his support of protective tariffs and a steady, cautious style of governance. When McKinley's successful presidential candidacy took place in 1896, America was in the throes of economic hardship and social upheaval. His calm hands, coupled with an economic rebound, won in popularity. By the time of his re-election in 1900, McKinley seemed to embody the spirit of a rising America. prosperous, confident, and increasingly assertive abroad. But all of this came to a brutal halt in September of 1901. McKinley traveled to Buffalo to attend the Pan American Exposition, a 5-month World's Fair devoted to innovation and progress. But on September the 6th, while greeting the public at the exposition's Temple of Music, he was approached by Leon Czolgosz, a man who believed organized government was corrupt and oppressive. Czolgosz carried a revolver beneath the handkerchief wrapped around his hand, something he used to feign an injury. When McKinley extended his own hand to him in greeting, the assassin unloaded 2 shots at the president, shooting straight into his target from near point-blank range. McKinley initially seemed to be calm, somehow even telling onlookers not to harm his assailant. Doctors rushed in to help, but medical techniques at the time were limited, leaving McKinley vulnerable to one of the great, especially for military men, hazards of the time: gangrene. For over a week, McKinley lingered between life and death before succumbing to infection on September the 14th, 1901. The consequences were profound. Vice President Theodore Roosevelt was sworn in to replace McKinley, becoming the youngest president in American history at just 42 years old. The contrast between the two couldn't have been greater. Where McKinley had been a steady, conservative hand, Roosevelt was dynamic, reform-minded, and unafraid of bold action. The new president ushered in the progressive era, targeting corporate monopolies, advancing conservation, and projecting U.S. power more forcefully abroad. McKinley's assassination could be seen as a brutal symbol of the age's tensions between wealth and poverty, tradition and radicalism, authority and rebellion. The assassin, for his part, was arrested, convicted, and sent straight to the electric chair, although the questions his act raised about social unrest, anarchism, and the vulnerability of democratic leaders lingered on. As a matter of fact, questions lingered to such an extent that they resulted in a dramatic shakeup of the security apparatus around US presidents. The US Secret Service already existed when McKinley was shot, but not to protect heads of state or other public officials as it does today. In fact, it had been founded to combat rampant counterfeiting of US currency, of all things. But after McKinley's assassination, Congress authorized the Secret Service to provide full-time protection for the President of the United States. At first, this was an informal arrangement, sort of a moonlighting gig in addition to protecting good old American hard cash. But it stuck, and by 1902, the Secret Service had become the de facto presidential protection agency. The assassination of McKinley was significant on many fronts. It helped propel the United States into a new century under Roosevelt's energetic leadership, and thus altered the very shape of modern American politics. It also lifted the Secret Service from a money protection unit into what it is today. The assassination of Pyotr Stolypin in Russia in 1911. Okay, so turning to Imperial Russia just a little over a decade later. At the time, this was a nation perched in a precarious position, rife with political assassinations, and likely to fall apart at just about any moment. How times have changed. Well, ultimately, the empire did fall apart, and it was one single assassination that helped tip it towards turmoil in September 1911. Now, you might be thinking, yes, I know we've heard all about the killing of Grigory Rasputin, the fall of the Romanovs, etc., etc. This is old news to us, but actually, this was an assassination which preceded the killing of Rasputin by 5 years, and which took place not in the Russian Empire's then capital of Petrograd, now known as St. Petersburg, but in Kiev, at that time just the capital of the Kiev Governorate in the Russian Empire's western reaches. Pyotr Stolypin was the Prime Minister of Russia under Tsar Nicholas II and a statesman who, like Juan Prim, had become a great hope of reform and the bitter enemy of radicals across the unstable Russian Empire. Stolypin had a long career in government service, first displayed by becoming the governor of Saratov in 1903. He gained a reputation for firmness of hand in the face of unrest, especially during the 1905 revolution, when Russia was convulsed by political violence following defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. His combination of severity and reform impressed the Tsar, and in 1906, Stolypin was appointed chairman of the Council of Ministers, effectively making him prime minister. Stolypin believed Russia's survival depended on both modernization and repression. He cracked down brutally on revolutionaries and dissenters, introducing military tribunals and executing thousands, to the extent that the gallows came to be nicknamed Stolypin's necktie. On the other hand, he introduced agrarian reforms, aiming to create a prosperous class of independent farmers by breaking up traditional peasant communes. In his vision, loyal land-owning peasants would become a bulwark against revolution, tying Russia's stability to the soil. Obviously, Obviously, the Bolsheviks and other revolutionaries would come to staunchly disagree with this. But it wasn't just them. Stolypin's Yin-Yang Act won him enemies everywhere. Conservatives feared his reforms would dismantle the good old order, and radicals saw him as repression personified. By 1911, Stolypin was increasingly isolated, viewed as too reformist by the right and too repressive by the left. On September 14th, 1911, the axe fell. Stolypin attended a performance at the Kiev Opera House alongside Tsar Nicholas II. During the second intermission, the man sauntered up to Stolypin and shot him twice, right in the view of the Tsar himself. Stolypin died 4 days later. On this occasion, the assassin was quickly apprehended. It was Dmitry Bogrov, an anarchist and member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party. Bizarrely, Bogrov was also an informant for the Okhrana, the Tsarist secret police, a kind of yin-yang act of his own. Perhaps unsurprisingly, speculation has abounded to this day as to whether Bogrov acted alone or as part of some deeper internal conspiracy. Either way, the consequences of Stolypin's death were profound. Without him, the momentum for gradual reform in Russia faltered. His agricultural policies were left incomplete. His political agenda was undone. Nicholas II, already isolated and resistant to change, lurched back to reactionary policies that further alienated moderates. Some historians argue that Stolypin represented one of the last real chances for Russia to modernize peacefully and avoid revolution. His assassination, therefore, was not just the silencing of a statesman, but the extinguishing of a path not taken. Less than 6 years later, the empire collapsed following the 1917 revolution. In hindsight, the bullets fired in Kiev in 1911 were not only aimed at a man, but at the fragile possibility of reform in a country racing toward catastrophe. The assassination of Alexander I Karadorovich in Marseille in 1934. Political nicknames are a bit weird. Some are pretty self-evident in their meaning. You'd probably be able to guess from whence the name Charles the Bewitched came from, the last Habsburg monarch of Spain, without having one of his paintings make it clear to you. Charles was born with physical and mental disabilities, which many people at the time attributed to nothing other than sorcery. In reality, his condition stemmed from generations of inbreeding within the Habsburg dynasty, and his various ailments left him weak, infertile, and unable to effectively govern throughout his reign, which helped hasten the end of the Habsburgs in Spain, over which they'd ruled uninterrupted for 184 years until Charles's death in 1700. But other names are more difficult to automatically discern, those of English King Ethelred the Unready, Viking leader Ivar the Boneless, Austrian Duke Albert the Peculiar, and Spanish King Alfonso the Slobberer are among those which come to mind. Maybe not the last one. But Alexander the Unifier would, in theory, fall seamlessly into the easy-to-understand category for historical rulers. Alexander Karadorovich was born in modern-day Montenegro to Serbian nobility. Before even inheriting the throne from his father, Peter, King of Serbia, he played a key role in the establishment of the Kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes in 1918, which rose partly from the ashes of both the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. After his father died in 1921, Alexander served as king for the next 13 years, during which time the entity he had helped realize was renamed the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. In doing so, he realized the dream of South Slavic unity and created an immense fiefdom from Austria to Greece and between Romania and the Adriatic, all under Serbian royal hegemony. One person who'd have no doubt admired all of this would have been Gavrilo Princip, but one person who definitely didn't was Vlado Chernozemski. You see, unifier or not, the territory he'd unified was the notoriously hard-to-unify Balkans. It's a hell of a sentence. And pretty soon, ruling over its diverse array of peoples proved pretty damn hard. The kingdom was a patchwork of Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosniaks, Macedonians, Albanians, Turks, Germans, Hungarians, and more. Many of these with their own national aspirations, grievances, and historic enmities. So Alexander tried to get them to all get along by force. In 1929, he suspended the constitution, outlawed nationalist parties, dissolved parliament, and imposed a royal dictatorship. He also promoted a centralized Yugoslav identity in place of competing ethnic loyalties, but his methods helped deepen existing resentments. Croat nationalists, in particular, saw him as an oppressor who smothered their political voice in the name of unity, and accordingly they began plotting. In the meantime, Alexander also sought to stabilize the Balkans' precarious position internationally. He forged alliances with France and the Little Entente, Czechoslovakia and Romania, in order to contain both Italian expansionism and Hungarian revisionism against the state. France in particular began to see Alexander as a key ally in holding together the fragile order of post-Versailles Europe. It was in this context that he wound up in France in October 1934 on a state visit to reaffirm Franco-Yugoslav ties. On October the 9th, his motorcade was making its way through the streets of Marseille. He was in an open car, sitting beside French Foreign Minister Louis Barthou. In a scene somewhat reminiscent of the demise of Franz Ferdinand described in the introduction, a man with a gun and malevolent intent lay lurking. This was Vlado Chernozemski, a member of the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, or IMRO, a Macedonian nationalist revolutionary organization in cahoots with the Croatian Stasi. Chernozemski burst through the police cordon and at point-blank range fired off a burst of shots which killed Alexander instantly and left Barthou mortally wounded. Chernozemski was quickly shot, stabbed, and beaten by the surrounding crowd and police, and was dead the same evening, not long after Barthou had died due to blood loss. The killing shocked Europe. It was the first assassination of a head of state ever captured on film, and the images of Alexander slumping lifeless in his car became seared in public memory. Perhaps just as significant was the political vacuum that it created. Alexander's young son, Peter II, was only 11 years old. A regency under Alexander's cousin, Prince Paul, was established, but it lacked Alexander's force of personality, one that would be severely needed to keep the warring nations of the Balkans from eating one another. The kingdom grew more unstable, with the political violence that Alexander's authoritarianism had suppressed now re-erupting. Within a few years, Yugoslavia was sliding toward fragmentation. The results abroad were equally severe. The involvement of the Stasi, operating from Italian and Hungarian territory, soured Yugoslavia's relations with both neighbors. What didn't help matters was that with Chernozemski dead, nobody was tried in France for organizing the assassination, despite evidence of the involvement of Croat extremists and Macedonian separatist organizations. France, for its part, lost a crucial ally at a time when Nazi Germany was already beginning its warpath. And so the killing of Alexander not only helped destabilize Yugoslavia, but also removed one of the last firm obstacles to Hitler's later penetration of the Balkans, one helped along the way by the involvement of none other than the Croatian Stasi. Like Prim's assassination in Spain, Alexander's murder was both the end of a life and the undoing of a precious political project, one whose collapse would have devastating consequences in the years to come. The assassination of Aldo Moro in Italy in 1978. And now to Italy in the 1970s. The 70s in Italy were known as the Anni di Piombo, or Years of Lead, basically a time of violent political extremism, domestic terrorism, and bitter ideological clashes. At the very center of this storm, the life and death of Aldo Moro became one of the defining traumas of modern Italian history. And while very far from unknown or forgotten, especially in Italy, the sheer brazenness of Moro's manner of death stands as almost as significant as what it came to mean for Italy in the years after. Moro was born in 1916 in the southern region of Apulia. A law professor by training, he rose through the ranks of the Christian Democratic Party, which had dominated Italian politics since the demise of fascism at the end of the Second World War. Thoughtful, soft-spoken, and deeply Catholic, Moro was not a fiery orator, but a shrewd negotiator and intellectual. Over the decades, he served as prime minister, foreign minister, party leader, earning a reputation as one of the most capable statesmen of post-war Italy. Moro's importance lay in his vision for Italy's future. By the 1970s, the Christian Democrats' grip on power was weakening, and the Italian Communist Party, or PCI, was surging in popularity. In most Western countries, communists were excluded from government altogether, being seen as a Trojan horse for the Soviet Union. But Moro advocated a bold experiment that he called the Historic Compromise. His idea was to bring the communists into a governing coalition with the Christian Democrats, not as a surrender to Marxism, but as a way of stabilizing Italy, diffusing extremism, and making democracy more inclusive. And it was a daring plan. To the left, it offered legitimacy and a share of responsibility. To the right, it was heresy, and might even come at the cost of Italy's place in the NATO alliance at the height of the Cold War. The United States was certainly not going to love the fact that a Western democracy might be governed with communist participation. But Moro pressed on, convinced that without compromise, Italy risked tearing itself apart. Unfortunately, though, it didn't really work. Despite his olive branch to the communists, among Moro's fiercest opponents remained a far-left militant group known as the Red Brigades, who aimed to topple the Italian state through violence. For them, Moro symbolized the system they despised: Christian Democrat dominance, the compromises of democracy, and the state's repression of radical groups. And so they decided that they'd target him directly. On the morning of March the 16th, 1978, Moro was on his way to the Parliament in Rome, where a confidence vote was scheduled that would formalize his coalition plan with communist support. But his car was ambushed by a Red Brigade's unit, and in a flurry of gunfire, Moro's 5 bodyguards were killed instantly. Moro was pulled from the vehicle and bundled into a waiting car, thereby becoming a hostage. For the next 55 days, he was held in captivity. The Red Brigades issued communiques demanding the release of imprisoned comrades in exchange for Moro's life. The government, led by interim Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti, refused to negotiate, insisting that the state could not be blackmailed by terrorists. As the days dragged on, Moro's letters from captivity were published, desperate, pleading appeals to his colleagues and even to the Pope. But Andreotti's government didn't bend, and Moro was more or less left to his fate by the system he had served. On May the 9th, Moro's bullet-ridden body was found stuffed into a car trunk on a street in Rome. The red Renault had symbolically been left halfway between the headquarters of the Christian Democrats and the Communists. The message was chillingly clear. The middle ground that Moro had sought to build was literally marked by his corpse. The repercussions were enormous, as Moro's historic compromise immediately died with him. The Christian Democrats turned away from cooperation, instead pursuing coalitions with smaller centrist and right-leaning parties. The Communist Party's momentum nosedived. Having previously been one of the largest such parties in Western Europe, the PCI's exclusion from power now became permanent. It never entered the national government and dissolved in 1991 at the end of the Cold War. Moro's death therefore became the high watermark of communist influence in Italian politics. The Red Brigades were hunted down with renewed vigor, and internationally, the assassination was seen as a grim reminder of how volatile Western Europe could be during the Cold War. Like Juan Prim in Spain or Pyotr Stolypin in Russia, Moro was cut down at the very moment when his vision might have reshaped his nation's future. Instead, his murder became both a symbol and warning of the dangers of extremism. The assassination of Anwar Sadat, president of Egypt in 1981. Alright, so this is a little out of place on this list, I guess. It's likely that many of you have heard of the assassination of Anwar Sadat, not least through its connection to the much later assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, president of Israel. The duo were linked not only through their similar fate under similar circumstances, but through their mutual connection to the 1978 Camp David Accords, as well as the 1979 Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty, which, though described as a cold peace, made Egypt the first Arab state to officially recognize Israel since its establishment 30 years before. Mohammed Anwar Sadat rose from humble beginnings to become a leading military officer and played a key role in the overthrow of Egyptian King Farouk in 1952, which turned Egypt into a republic. With this, Sadat gained massive political capital and ultimately became Egypt's third president following the death of his predecessor and ally, Gamal Abdel Nasser. But Sadat's priorities contrasted more than a little with those of Nasser. While the latter championed pan-Arabism and confrontation with Israel, Sadat was pragmatic and willing to gamble Egypt's prestige for survival. Nor did he discard his military edge during his presidency. In October 1973, he shocked the world by launching a surprise attack against Israeli forces across the Suez Canal, leading to the 2-week-long Yom Kippur War and the Arab coalition's first success, kind of, against their bitter enemy. With regards to Israel, the term of Sadat linked multiple instances of new ground being broken in what was by now a long-winded conflict, since the decades before his rise had been utterly dominated by the Arab-Israeli conflict. After Israel declared independence in 1948, Egypt joined other Arab states in war against the fledgling nation. The result was humiliation. Israel not only survived, but expanded its territory, while hundreds of thousands of Palestinians became refugees. For Egypt, the wound cut deep. Another crushing defeat followed in 1967 with the Six-Day War, when Israel took the Sinai Peninsula out of Egypt's hands, along with Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. Egyptian pride had been shattered, its army broken, and Nasser humiliated. This was the crisis that Sadat inherited in 1970, and few believed that he could restore Egypt's fortunes. But the 1973 Yom Kippur War did accomplish that. Egyptian forces stormed across the Suez Canal, while Syrian forces advanced in the Golan Heights. For the first time since 1948, Arab armies had bloodied Israel. And although the war ended with an Israeli counterattack that cut deep into Egyptian territory, the psychological balance had shifted. Egypt could claim a kind of victory, and Sadat had proven himself a bold and capable strategist. East. This gave Sadat leverage. Unlike Nasser, who had insisted on Israel's destruction, his successor concluded that Egypt's survival depended on negotiation, not endless conflict. So, in a move that shocked Arabs and Israelis alike, he turned to diplomacy. In 1977, he took the unprecedented step of visiting Jerusalem and addressed the Israeli Knesset, the legislative chamber, directly. It was a massive gesture, being broadcast worldwide, and it opened the door to serious talks. This led to the Camp David Accords of 1978, brokered by then US President Jimmy Carter. For nearly 2 weeks, Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin negotiated in the isolation of the American presidential retreat in Camp David, Maryland. The Accords led to the Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty the following year, for which Sadat and Begin shared the 1979 Nobel Peace Prize. Egypt regained the Sinai Peninsula, occupied since 1967, and in exchange, Israel won recognition from its largest and most powerful Arab neighbor. But the price was enormous. Across the Arab world, Sadat was branded a traitor. Syria, Iraq, and Libya jointly denounced him. The Arab League suspended Egypt, and Cairo found itself diplomatically isolated. The Palestinians also responded to Sadat's deal as a betrayal. For its Arab allies, Egypt had broken ranks, leaving them to struggle alone. And inside Egypt, too, discontent grew. Some admired Sadat's courage, but many saw him as abandoning Arab unity in exchange for American dollars and Israeli approval. At the same time, Sadat's domestic policies added fuel to the fire. His so-called intifar, or economic liberalization, opened Egypt's markets to foreign investment and privatization, but wealth flowed unevenly. Inequality grew, the poor struggled, and resentment simmered. Sadat compounded this with political repression, cracking down on dissent from leftists, nationalists, and especially Islamists. Radical groups like Egyptian Islamic Jihad viewed him not only as a tyrant, but as an apostate who had betrayed Islam by making peace with Israel. By 1981, the threats against Sadat were clear, but buoyed either by misguidance or bravado, he appeared not to notice them. He often appeared in public without bulletproof glass, almost as if he was tempting fate. Perhaps, like many leaders before him, he simply underestimated his enemies. On October 6, 1981, Sadat attended a military parade in Cairo commemorating the October War of 1973, the very war that had cemented his reputation. Jets flew overhead, tanks rolled past, and Sadat, clad in full military uniform with a chest full of medals, sat in the stand beside his vice president, Hosni Mubarak, and various foreign dignitaries. As a column of soldiers passed, a truck halted before the reviewing stand. Out of it burst men in military uniforms who, by attire alone, would not look out of place at such an event. But they were assassins with a singular mission in mind. One of the men, Lieutenant Khalid Islambouli, shouted, "Death to the Pharaoh," before hurling grenades at the presidential suite and opening fire with an assault rifle. Smoke, gunfire, and screams filled the air, and Sadat, hit multiple times, collapsed in his chair. He was rushed to the hospital but died within hours. The assassins were members of Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which proclaimed that they had struck down a tyrant who had betrayed Islam and the Arab cause. To them, Sadat's peace treaty with Israel was the ultimate crime. His death, like Prim's in Madrid, Stolypin's in Kiev, and Alexander Caradorge's in Marseille, symbolized not only the silencing of a statesman, but the collapse of a fragile path toward peaceful transformation. The consequences, as with those others, were immense. Sadat wasn't the only casualty of the brutal attack. 10 others were killed, including a visiting general from Amman, the high-ranking bishop of the Egyptian Coptic Orthodox Church, several highly ranked Egyptian military figures, a presidential aide, and several bodyguards, as well as James J. Kelly, an Irish Defence Forces officer serving as a UN observer. But one person who didn't die was Vice President Hosni Mubarak, who succeeded in ducking out of the line of fire and escaped with only minor injuries. Mubarak succeeded Sadat and went on to rule Egypt for the next 3 decades until his own violent overthrow in 2011 during the Egyptian Revolution. Meanwhile, the peace treaty with Israel survived, but Egypt remained ambivalent, with its people never fully reconciled to it. Sadat's gamble had brought Egypt peace, but at the cost of both his life and his country's image among his neighbors. Sadat's assassination was both inevitable and tragic. His bold break with decades of hostility made him enemies at home and abroad, but his death froze Egypt's experiments in peace and reform. Although relative stability followed under Mubarak, revolution would return to Egypt not only in 2011, but with the military overthrow of his successor, Mohamed Morsi, by military forces under General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi 2 years later. The bullets fired in Cairo in 1981 were aimed not just at a man, but at a vision of the Middle East that might have been. Joint assassination of Rwandan and Burundian presidents in 1994. Now then, for our final instance in today's video, we're going to move slightly forward in time, but remain on the same continent. This time, we turn to Central Africa at an act of violence whose immediate consequences were catastrophic on their own, but whose reverberations helped engineer one of the worst atrocities in human history and shaped a nation's destiny for decades. Juvenal Habyarimana was a long-serving president of Rwanda who, by 1994, had held office for more than 2 decades. A military officer by training, once again, Habyarimana had risen through the military ranks after Rwanda's independence from Belgium in 1962 and clinched power in 1973 through a bloodless coup that ousted his predecessor, Gregoire Kayibanda. But most significantly in this instance, certainly far more so than any other entry on this list, was Habyarimana's ethnicity. He was a member of the Hutu ethnic group, which had dominated Rwandan politics since a 1959 revolution that had displaced the Tutsi aristocracy. Once in power, he established a one-party state under his party, the National Revolutionary Movement for Development, and presented himself as a stabilizer. It seemed to work. For years, Rwanda was portrayed as relatively calm compared to some of its neighbors. But beneath the surface, tensions festered. The roots of the problem lay in Rwanda's past. Under Belgian rule, rigid ethnic divisions between Hutu and Tutsi had grown, exacerbating inequalities and sowing distrust. After independence and once in power, the Hutu sidelined the Tutsi minority, leading to cycles of persecution and waves of Tutsi refugees fleeing to neighboring Uganda, Burundi, and Zaire. By the 1980s, many exiled Tutsis had grown restless. In 1987, the Rwandan Patriotic Front was founded in Uganda by Fred Rwema Paul Kagame. Made up of largely Tutsi exiles, it launched an armed invasion into Rwanda in 1990, sparking the Rwandan Civil War. By that time, Habyarimana had been president of Rwanda for 17 years, and his grip on power was weakening. Under international pressure, he signed the Arusha Accords in 1993, which would see his government enter a power-sharing arrangement with the RPF. But hardline Hutu factions were outraged. Extremist groups, such as the Interahamwe militia, spread propaganda portraying Tutsis as enemies of the state. The grounds were set for a brutal episode of violence. On April 6, 1994, everything came to a head. Habyarimana was returning to Rwanda by airplane from Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, having attended a regional summit and efforts to resolve the still ongoing Rwandan civil war. Also on the plane was Cyprien Ntaramira, who'd become president of nearby Burundi only 2 months before. Both men were traveling with their respective entourages. They were also both Hutu. As the plane descended towards Kigali, Rwanda's capital city, it was suddenly struck by a powerful surface-to-air missile. The aircraft crashed into the grounds of none other than the Rwandan presidential palace, killing all on board. To this day, the identity of the assassin remains disputed. Some blame Hutu extremists opposed to compromise with the RPF. Others accuse the RPF itself of orchestrating the attack to seize power. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in modern history. Within hours of the crash, roadblocks appeared in Kigali, and an unrestrained slaughter began. Extremist militias, supported by elements of the Rwandan army, launched a campaign of extermination against the Tutsis and moderate Hutus. In short, the assassinations were the spark that ignited the Rwandan genocide. The ramifications were immense. The RPF, led by Kagame, eventually defeated government forces and took control of Rwanda, thereby ending the genocide and the civil war itself. But what had occurred by then was a carnival of violence almost without parallel. In only 100 days, an estimated 800,000 had been killed in one of the swiftest genocides of the 20th century. The ramifications also extended beyond Rwanda's borders. Fighting spilled into nearby Zaire, fueling the First and Second Congo Wars, which destabilized Central Africa for decades. Internationally, the world's failure to intervene decisively during the genocide scarred the reputations of the UN and Western powers, reshaping debates about humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect. Habyarimana's assassination thus stands as a brutal hinge point in history, the single act that unleashed unimaginable bloodshed, toppled an old regime, and redrew the political map of Central Africa. Thank you for watching.